I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a virtual In Conversation with the Rosenbach. I am Edward G. Pettit. Tonight we have Colm Tóibín to talk about music in Ulysses. This is part of our celebration of the centenary of the publication of Joyce's novel, Ulysses. Welcome, Colm. I'm glad you can make it tonight.
Hey, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Good. Let me get through a little business here for the Rosenbach first. We have a complete manuscript of Ulysses. Many of you, if many of you know that already, as well as first editions, many other items of Joycean interest. And every year we celebrate Bloomsday with a big street festival on June 16th. And this year, after 2 years of having virtual celebrations for Bloomsday, we're returning to the in-person festival on our street right outside the Rosenbach on Delancey Place, where we read portions of the novel all day long from 11 a.m. until 8 at night. We also have a beer garden. We have food trucks. There's music all day long. And you can see our exhibition, which is now on view at the Rosenbach, called 18 Reasons to Read Ulysses, a Centennial Celebration, presenting 18 highlights from the manuscript, each representing a single theme. And in addition to Joyce's manuscript and other objects in the Rosenbach's collection, there's over 100 paintings by contemporary artist Heather Ryan Kelly inspired by Ulysses. And this is all on view in our galleries right now. We bring this virtual program to you for free. So if you would like to help support the Rosenbach, either by donation or by becoming a member, you can do so by visiting our website. Your support helps us care for our collections, helps us bring more programs like this one to you. And you can find out more about all that at our website, including our Bloomsday Festival, rosenbach.org. I hope to see many of you on June 16th. But tonight, we are bringing you Colm Tóibín, one of the most important Irish authors of the present day. He's the author of 10 novels, including The Magician, his most recent novel. He's also a professor of humanities at Columbia University and the editor of 100 Years of James Joyce's Ulysses, just published from Penn State University Press. We're very pleased to have him here tonight. Colm, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And welcome back, because you were just here in January, did a virtual program for us about The Magician, which was quite wonderful. What are your Bloomsday plans this year? Where are you going to be celebrating?
I'm going to be doing a thing at the Morgan, that there's a sort of small party at the Morgan. So I'm going to be, for about 12 minutes, I'm going to be Leopold Bloom.
Good.
I'm going to sound like him. I'm going to look like him. I'm going to think like him. And I think it'll be a big improvement.
That's great. That's fun. Good. Well, they're doing great things up the Morgan too. Some of the things from the some of the items from the Rosenbach's collection are in the Morgan's new exhibition as well.
Yeah, we're very grateful to you for that.
Yeah, so that'll be really nice. Our plan for the evening, everyone, is Colm is going to talk about music in Ulysses, a very important part of the book too. We, matter of fact, at our Bloomsday celebration, I think there's 13 different songs we have sung and played throughout the day, mixed in with the readings. So it's very present in the novel. If you have questions for our speaker, put them in the chat box, and then after his talk, we'll get to the questions and we'll do that. Sound like a plan? All ready, Colm?
The opening sentence of Edith Wharton's novel, The Age of Innocence, which was published in 1920, therefore 2 years before Ulysses, it offers the reader a great temptation. It reads, on a January evening of the early 70s, Christine Nilsson was singing Faust in the Academy of Music in New York. This opening scene of the novel, a work begun immediately after the First World War, and will dramatize the cream of old New York society, witnessing a performance of her work which will deal, however lightly and sonorously, with the pact with the devil, with the world in which the devil is present and temptation is close to, in which those in need of knowledge will fall into the clutches of someone who will offer them earthly powers and joys in exchange for the loss of their soul, and this loss in turn will lead to eternal damnation. What is soon clear, however, is that this is merely a shadowy sort of temptation, that Wharton has no interest at all in the devil or the soul, that the opera has been named not as a sign to us to attend to the place of the Faustian bargain in the pattern of the novel, but rather because the opera Gounod's Faust, in all its strange unfaustian brightness and sweet music, was in fact one of the favorites in the New York music world of that time, an age of innocence, as Wharton would have it. It was, for example, the opening opera of the new Metropolitan Opera House in New York in 1883, and one of the most often performed there in the 20th century. In the opening pages of the book, Newland Archer, who is the main protagonist, arrives in his box at the Opera House as the curtain had not just gone down on the garden scene. He knew it was not the thing to arrive early at the opera. The moment he begins to watch the opera has no sense of a dark bargain or a drama around the eternal life and eternal knowledge. It is instead the moment where the singer is sprinkling daisy petals with notes as clear as dew and singing, "He loves me not." As Archer begins to look around at who is in the other boxes, the author takes note, in parentheses, that the boxes always stop talking during the daisy song. And thus something else becomes clear. The music is being used deliberately as backdrop rather than foreground. The characters in the novel that are in the audience are being shown to us all in their narrowness and philistinism by the way in which they do not respond to the music, rather than by the way in which they allow the music to fill their spirit. Newland Archer also catches sight of the young woman who he is to marry at the opera. And in that moment, one of the ways in which music can be used in fiction comes to the fore. As he is watching May Welland, she's forced to be still. You can see her face in repose, her absorbed young face, as Wharton puts it. You can try to read her more intensely than he could in a social setting. Or in a conversation, he can feel what's called a tender reverence for her abysmal purity. She does not even guess, he feels, the implications of the scene she's watching. It occurs to him that she and he can read fast together by the Italian lakes once they're married. Wharton lets him have this thought, but adds her own wry comment on it, writing that Newland was somewhat hazily confusing the scene of his projected honeymoon with the masterpiece of literature, which it would be his manly privilege to reveal to his bride. She ends the paragraph by letting Newland picture his bride in some scene of old European witchery. As Archer becomes entangled emotionally with Welland's cousin Ellen, the Countess Olenska, the question of Europe and of witchery arises, but it does so in the entirely secular space of an old New York obsessed by status and money and manners and class, a New York which Newland Archer both belongs to and tries to live at a distance from. Although he reads books in the quietness of his study in the evenings, the study is a secular space, as is the house, as his dreams and ambitions are secular, as the world around him is concerned with material things. This is the space which the novel form in general is at its most content. Money and status are handed from one generation to the next. Society is stable. Young people want to be married. The novel can offer temptation to the young people, but it will be mild temptation. The temptation, for example, to flirt with the possibility of running away with a married woman, or the temptation to receive or not receive outsiders or people who have broken the rules into the society. And then all will come right again. Bright order will be restored. The novel, which begins with a reference to Faust, will proceed according to the terms of a more innocent bargain. Large questions will be replaced by more glancing ones. The devil will not stalk the streets of Manhattan looking for souls. Throughout his life as a novelist, from Buddenbrooks to Dr. Faustus, Thomas Mann allowed music to enter into the essential spirit of his novels. He allowed music to stand for many things, including the soaring human spirit itself, or indeed a German spirit in all its complexity, but also decay and death, as well as danger, violence, decadence. Towards the end of his novel, The Magic Mountain, published 4 years after Wharton's The Age of Innocence, Mann invoked the same opera, Gounod's Faust, as she did at the opening of her novel. Mann allows Hans Castorp to listen to a recording of Valentin's prayer from the opera. Mann muses on the military tone of the aria, its status as prayer in its middle stanza, whose spirit was gallant, chivalresque, warlike, light-hearted, but equally devout. If the opera in general left the characters in Edith Wharton's novel untouched, it touched Hans Castorp to the depths of his soul. Later, when they're having seances in the sanatorium, they attempt to convince Castorp, despite his unease, to return to the room and take part. His change of mind, the novel writes, occurred when he was alone in the music room one evening, playing yet once again the recording stamped with the personality of Valentine, for whom he felt such great sympathy. He sat in the chair and listened to this good soldier pray as he answered the call to depart for the field of honor. As always, when Hans Castorp listened to this aria, deep emotion stirred within him, strengthened this time by certain possibilities that were compacted into a wish. The wish will be to evoke the presence of his dead cousin, Joachim. 10 pages later, as the seance goes on with the help of the medium, Hans Castorp wants to have the aria played, as though the aria will summon his cousin back from death. But the record is not in the room, and no one can leave the room as it will break the spell. Suddenly, however, it emerges that the record has in fact been put into the wrong sleeve, and thus, as though by a miracle, is in the room and can be played. They listen. The power of the aria is invoked. When it is finished, they are silent. The novel reads, "Now, Hans Castorp lifted his head, and without having to search, his eyes looked in the right direction." The novel goes on. "There was one more person than before in the room. There, off to the side of the semicircle in the background, where the red light was swallowed up in night that the eye could barely pierce, between the doctor's wide desk and the folding screen, there, on the patient's chair, turned towards the room, there sat Joachim. It was Joachim, with his shadowy, hollow cheeks and warrior's beard, from his final days, with lips arched and proud." Thus, the very music which has been used as a backdrop in Edith Wharton's novel, which signals a deep materialism and philistinism in the characters who will attempt to control Newland Archer's life, this same thing will be used 4 years later to allow magic into a novel, to allow the moment of pure transcendence to occur. It will dramatize the appearance of a dead person using a form of art, the novel, which we generally associate only with the living. What is interesting here is that for a ghost to be invoked, for the novel to give up its own insistence on the secular and the non-spiritual, music will be the mechanism to make this happen, to create the atmosphere for it, and to make it credible. In Dr. Faustus, which is published more than 20 years later, Thomas Mann will return to the idea of the otherworldly and place it carefully at the center of his narrative. He will invoke religion and the spirit in the very early pages of the book, before allowing the history of church music, the German tradition in music, and then the actual composing of music, to attempt to chart not merely the journey into madness of his hero, but also what happened in Germany in those same years. He will use music, references to music, the constant invocation of music, to lift his novel beyond the merely political or human sphere into realms where light does battle with darkness. In his novel of music, the devil will play as important a role as money will in other novels or mere human desires. There's a sense of the novel sometimes as a force that is unhappy with itself, uneasy about its limits in bourgeois culture, wishing to have more power to push out the boundaries that have been set for it in the merely secular world. As some novelists, such as Thomas Mann, wish to move beyond the dull drama of the here and now and reach towards larger subjects, more properly belonging to the philosopher or the theologian. References to music become one of the ways out of the worldly dilemma towards unworldly mystery, towards subjects which novelists don't often tackle. The power of music and the sense of a world beyond our world, which music evokes, can also invoke a world in which strange bargains can be made, a world in which evil does battle with good, as in Mann's Dr. Faustus, or in which a note in music can in itself contain a sense of evil in all its infinite mystery and power, more than a word can. Other novelists, such as James Joyce, who we're here to talk about, have managed to weave religion into a larger fabric, including the sheer drama of faith and doubt, and have managed also to include the comic possibilities of dogma and ritual to liven up their books. In the very opening few lines of Ulysses, for example, Buck Mulligan intones the opening of the Latin Mass in Tribur ad altare Dei, as he holds aloft a bowl of shaving lather on which a mirror and a razor-like cross. Later in the book, Leopold Bloom, musing on the use of wine in the Mass, comes to the fine conclusion that wine is more aristocratic than, for example, ginger ale. One of the purposes of literature, as Joyce made clear, is to put religion in its place. Joyce, in his collection of stories, Dubliner, slowly weaves the theme of music into the fabric of the narrative. In the sixth story, Two Gallants, the figures in the story walk almost aimlessly in Dublin and then turn from Nassau Street into Kildare Street. The music they encounter here has no overt function in the construction of the story. Rather, its function is buried in the undercurrent of the story, part of its rhythm or its dynamic or its essence, rather than say its plot or its surface. It is here as a sort of shivering example of what lies under things, to place against the hard detail of motive and action and sentiment in the story. It reads, not far from the porch of the club, a harpist stood in the roadway, playing to a little ring of listeners. He plucked at the wires heedlessly, glancing quickly from time to time at the face of each newcomer, and from time to time wearily also at the sky. His harp too, heedless that her coverings had fallen about her knees, seemed weary alike of the eyes of strangers and of her master's hands. One hand played in the bass the melody of Silent O'Moyle, while the other hand careered in the treble after each group of notes. The notes of the air throbbed deep and full. In a later story in Joyce's Dubliners, a story called Clay, Maria, a middle-aged spinster makes a visit to a family whom she had known years before. There are games for the children and some music and dancing. At the story's center is a moment where, during a game, when she's blindfolded, Maria holds out her hands. Instead of a gift or an object such as a ring that would mean marriage, the children put clay from the garden into the palm of her outstretched hands. She felt a soft, wet substance with her fingers and was surprised that nobody spoke or took off her bandage. The clay, as it disrupts the simple, jolly evening, moves the story out of its simplicity towards mystery. The clay seems to promise death. Because the tone of the story has been turned, some further image now is required. Because of the use of clay and its association with death, the story cannot return to its earlier tone of one brisk, non-visionary descriptive sentence followed by another. The secular space of the story has been disturbed. One solution would be to allow Maria to have a sort of visionary experience that would offer a totalizing image, a way of moving above and beyond the limits of the story towards some other space, whether using rhythm or image. The solution Joyce chooses is a musical solution. At the end of the story, they ask Maria to sing, and she sings an aria from the light opera, The Bohemian Girl, by Balfe, called I Dreamt That I Dwelt in Marble Halls. But when she comes to the second verse, she sings the first verse again, thus offering the story another disruption, a second piece of strangeness after the clay, but within the lifting melody of the music, which moves the host emotionally, so his eyes fill up with tears as the story ends. In a later story in Dubliners, a story called A Mother, music is placed at the very center of what happens in the story, but it is placed beside the story's second theme, which is money. Mrs. Carney's daughter, Kathleen, is contracted to be the accompanist at 4 concerts in Dublin. Unfortunately, the first 3 concerts are badly attended, and thus the mother realizes that the organizers intend not to pay her daughter. The drama of the story centers on the efforts of the mother to have her daughter paid. What is interesting here is that the possibilities that the music offers are cancelled out by the more worldly concerns, that the music, as in Edith Wharton, becomes a backdrop as money takes center stage. It is as though Joyce has allowed a battle to take place in these pages between the proper concerns of the fiction writer, such as broken promises, greed, money, the relationships within a family, and the more transcendent and mysterious matter of music, which is a place in fiction only when it is required, when there is a special need for it. And he has allowed the first concern, the temporal one, to win hands down over the second, the spiritual one, thus putting music back in its place for the moment. It is possible that doing that left Joyce free then for the use of music as the nourishing and uplifting and binding ingredient in his story, The Dead, the final story in Dubliners. The 3 denizens of the house where the party at the center of the story takes place are involved in the world of Dublin music. Mary Jane, the niece, plays the organ in a church and teaches music. One of her aunts is the lead soprano in a church choir. The other gives piano lessons to beginners. Many of those who are invited to the party are members of the church choir or pupils of the aunt or the niece. The party at the core of the story, The Dead, will include the playing of music and singing, but it will also involve a discussion about the relative merits of various singers and the talk of opera and opera companies. When the niece mentions Thomas's opera Mignon, she adds that it made her think of poor Georgina Burns, who may be a student or a friend who had died, but in any case is someone whose very name invokes sadness. Soon, her aunt mentions a favorite singer of the past. There was only one tenor, she said, to please me, I mean. And then she continues, his name was Parkinson. I heard him when he was in his prime, and I think he had the purest tenor voice that was ever put into a man's throat. No one else at the table has heard of him. This idea of a singer whose fame has ended brings with it a sharp and shivering realization that time has passed and will pass again, and memories grow fainter. The fact that the memory is of a singer rather than, say, a politician or a public figure has an added pathos because the power of the figure, whose name is almost forgotten, was not a fully temporal one. His fame came from breath, from his way of moving the human spirit through song. Music is placed at the forefront of the story of the dead to suggest an absence as well as to other work, such as the evocation of the spirit. This is Dublin in the early years of the 20th century. It is in that period in Irish history after the fall of Charles Stewart Parnell, who was promised home rule for Ireland, and the beginnings of a political separation from the British Empire and the outbreak of the First World War, which will see the beginning of the armed struggle for political independence in Ireland. Thus, it seems to be a period of peace, but it's also a period when private life has become more intense in the absence of a solid and energized public life, and when forms of utterance such as poetry and song have often taken the place of political debate. Song and music in the story, therefore, are not incidental. They are not there merely to provide flavor or context or atmosphere. They're essential ways of filling a sort of silence. While the characters in the collection of stories Dubliners have a fierce privacy, a picture slowly emerges, however, of a public fictional space, a society, however pale and limited and filled with absences, begins to take shape. It is too simple to use the word colonized to describe the denizens of Dubliners, but nonetheless, the idea that they are living in a place where the public sphere does not flourish has to be taken into consideration. It is there in the shadows, as it were, by implication. It is easy to imagine this final story of the dead happening in a number of other cities besides Dublin, capital cities which, like Dublin, did not have a parliament and in which there was no government, cities where the two languages or two cultures seemed to clash, cities which dreamed of sacred places in the countryside in which the soul of the citizens could be purified, cities caught between a dull, deadly provinciality and the even duller possibility of cosmopolitanism. The Dublin of the dead has echoes of Barcelona, of Calcutta or Edinburgh in the early years of the 20th century, places where musical life could also be conducted with a peculiar intensity and songs and singers handed a strange power. In all four cities, music and song moved from the world of entertainment to become or replace or suggest what was missing in the public world. Songs in these cities in these years had a mystical power, and politics too, for certain people, a mystical edge. Thus, a gathering of people who knew one another because of music, which happens in the dead and happens also in the novel Ulysses, could take on a power beyond the mere idea of music as recreation or entertainment. In all four societies, Ireland, Catalonia, Bengal, Scotland, two languages were in conflict, or at least there was an older shadow language against the one of substance. It is easy to imagine some of the events that happen in Joyce's story, The Dead, happening in a similar story set in those other societies. As with Gabriel in The Dead, it is easy to imagine a Calcutta intellectual being attacked for not writing in his native language, Bengali, and being married to a woman from the countryside whom he, so urbanized and deracinated, will come to misunderstand and almost foolishly desire. And like Gabriel too, it is easy to imagine a Catalan intellectual attacked for not writing his book reviews in Catalan, or a Scottish intellectual berated for not wearing a kilt. In all these societies, as in many others, from the 1870s onwards, there was a fetishization, first by poets and playwrights and painters, and then by intellectuals and politicians, of the countryside itself. Just as the fetishization of the Aran Islands becomes part of the fabric of the dead, there was also a fetishization of place outside the city of Barcelona, say, such as the Canigó or Montseng, and also the Bengali countryside and the Highlands of Scotland. This was the primal landscape where the idea of the unfree nation was at its most pure and uncontaminated and uncomplex. Towards the end of the dead, then the tone changes, moves into a more and more private space as Gabriel, whose aunt's party this is, stands in the hallway on the point of leaving and watches his wife on the stairs, listening to a song which is coming from an upper room. As the story proceeds, the tone and diction of the story change. They move towards some level of mysterious feeling which has been absent from the story up to now. Gabriel, quote, stood in the gloom of the hall, trying to catch the air that the voice was singing and gazing up at his wife. There was a grace and mystery in her attitude, as if she were a symbol of something. Slowly then, as he listens in the hallway, he recognizes the song. The voice of the singer, Joyce writes, made plaintive by distance and by the singer's hoarseness, faintly illuminated the cadence of the air with words expressing grief. The words of the song and his wife's expressions filled Gabriel with desire for her. But for her, for Greta, his wife, the words of the song have reminded her of someone who was once in love with her and whom she had loved, a young man from the west of Ireland who died. When she tells her husband this in a Dublin hotel room after the party, it is as though the cadences of the song have moved the story into another realm towards which it was reaching all the time, a realm beyond the ordinary, the realm of ordinary love and desire and memory. The story is moving towards a more mysterious space, almost a religious one, or one in which eternity becomes more important than time and the dead more present than the living. Indeed, space itself, as the story moves towards its concluding sentences, moves out of the confines of walls and houses into the unknown, mysterious landscape of the west of Ireland, as though seen from the sky above. The cadences of the story move too, from the condition of prose towards the condition of music, or at least from the prosaic cadences of description and the everyday, into cadences that seem closer to prayer, or more elevated in their use of soft repetitions and sounds. In the second last paragraph, as Gabriel thinks of the young man, Michael Fury, with whom his wife had been in love, he imagined that he sees his form standing under a dripping tree. This form then becomes a more abstract form or set of forms. The next sentence reads, "Other forms were near." It is clear that these forms are not material forms or forms that live in society or are at ease generally in the systems which fiction has invented for itself. The next sentence will use a word that novelists use sparingly and carefully. It is the word soul. It will read, "His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hordes of the dead." The language is taking on tones that are almost archaic or pre-Raphaelite. It goes on, "He was conscious of, but could not apprehend their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into a grey, impalpable world. The solid world itself, which these dead had at one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling." It's important to remember that the early parts of the story involve social encounters. They include Gabriel noticing the guests and the party with care and uneasy attention. This new tone in the story was created by a song, by the invocation of music in the body of a piece of fiction. The song has not merely caused a change in the patterns of the sentences, how they might sound, but as with the song from Gounod's Faust in the Magic Mountain, it has invoked a realm that is not the normal realm of fiction. It has invoked the soul, the dead, the impalpable world. The last paragraph of the story, which has 9 sentences, begins with 3 simple sentences. It is only in the third one that the hushed, incantatory, totalizing sound that will take over the paragraph eventually can be heard. The flakes of snow are dark and silver, the adjectives coming after the noun, all the more to heighten the sense of mystery and poetry here. It is in the 5th sentence that the prose style and what is being invoked begin to lift irrevocably from the mere social occasion, or indeed the action that is so much part of fiction too, of a man thinking. They read, "It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and will end with his soul swooned slowly, as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent upon the last end of the living and the dead." James Joyce's Ulysses, which is published 2 years after The Age of Innocence and 2 years before The Magic Mountain, is filled with snatches of ballads and arias. 48 people named in the book, as Vivian Igo has written, are, quote, connected with various forms of entertainment. Joyce himself had a tenor voice, and there are many descriptions of parties and dinners during his long exile in Trieste in Paris, which he would sing Irish ballads and opera arias. In an essay on Ulysses, first published in 1966, Anthony Cronin, the poet, wrote about the importance of music in the novel Ulysses. But a common misconception, he wrote, about Ulysses is that its characters are a cross-section of middle or lower middle-class Dublin. They are, in fact, splendidly typical of a certain kind of Dubliner. But not even in a city so small as Dublin could they all or nearly all be so well acquainted with each other unless they had a bond of activity in common. That activity is song. With the exception of Stephen's medical friends, practically every character is connected with that world of semi-professional, semi-amateur concert and operatic singing which flourished in Dublin. Joyce and his parents belong to this, and apart from the students, Father Conmee and the company in the library, it furnishes the cast of the book. It might be easy to see the references to song and the use of singing in Ulysses as a sideshow, or as a way, as Cronin suggests, of connecting the characters into a sort of inner world, one that can, in certain moments, sort of class or circumstances, allowing characters to transform a room. But song in the work of Joyce also has a more powerful purpose. This is explored first in the description of Aunt Julia's song in The Dead. Her voice, strong and clear in tone, attacked with great spirit the runs which embellish the air, and though she sang very rapidly, she did not miss even the smallest of the grace notes. To follow the voice without looking at the singer's face was to feel and share the excitement of swift and secure flight. In these years, I'm talking about the early years of the 20th century, where the novel is set, the novel Ulysses, meaning in 1904, the song took on a special intensity in Dublin, in a city that partly saw itself as the capital of a nation that was not a state. There were absences and silences. The power of the Anglo-Irish may have waned as the influence of local politicians increased, but there was still no national parliament, no sense that the city was a site for solid government. Mr. David Sheehy, MP, whose wife appears in Ulysses, went to London, to Westminster, to make his speeches. They were reported by journalists from there. Public rhetoric in Dublin was easier to parody than to practice. The Local Government Act of 1898 and the Wyndham Land Act of 1903 consolidated and destroyed systems of rule, but they also opened a window. Instead of satisfying political needs, these changes allowed some to dream of further change. In these years, the dreams became even dreamier and thus harder to pin down or defeat. In the early years of the 20th century in Ireland, various forms of utterance, a poem, a translation, a play, a story, a novel, a speech over a grave, a song, carried an authority that was all the more powerful because it was often fragile, delicate, melancholy, or had a heightened rhetorical tone. In his 1922 essay, Ireland After Parnell, W.B. Yeats noted that he had predicted the rise of an intellectual movement at the first lull of politics. Thus, by 1891, once Parnell was out of the way, Yeats believed that Ireland was to be like soft wax in the years to come. The life of the imagination, he saw, was to replace arguments about politics. It would be too much to argue, to suggest that song actually replaces politics in the world of the characters in Ulysses. Yet singing in the novel invokes a higher form of yearning. In Dublin, in the early years of the 20th century, music life was conducted with a particular concentration. Songs and singers were handed the forceful, ghostly power that Parkinson has for Aunt Kate. Feeling about lost love in a song could become feeling about other things that have been lost, such as an imagined country or an imagined sense of autonomy. Songs and other forms of music, including opera, were before anything else an ordinary part of life in Dublin. But a soaring voice, the hitting of a high note, the use of a grace note, moved the mind into the realm of aspiration. Pure soul, longing, transforming itself to include large and unnameable things, as well as the singer's enduring spirit on transcendent display. This idea of song as a kind of yearning with a power reaching beyond itself, and the idea of leitmotif and recurrent themes in music making its way into the pattern and design of a novel makes us wonder how much attention James Joyce paid to the music of Richard Wagner, and how much was known of Wagner's music in Dublin before Joyce left the city in 1904. One of Joyce's college friends, J.F. Byrne, later commented, "As we grew older, it was Wagner who attracted us, especially by such of his music as Tristan and Isolde and Lohengrin." Wagner's operas were part of Dublin's musical life at the end of the 19th century. Enough for Leopold Bloom to comment, Wagnerian music, though confessedly grand in its way, was a bit too heavy and hard to follow at the first go. Jerry Smith writes in his book, Music and Sound, in the life and literature of James Joyce, that favorites such as Lohengrin and Tannhäuser played with one or two exceptions between 1888 and 1904 in Dublin. Wagner's other operas were also performed. 1901 saw the first Dublin performance of Siegfried and Tristan and Isolde. Alex Ross, in his book, Wagnerisms, notes a passage from Wagner's essay, A Communication to My Friends, written in 1851, in which the composer names two analogues of the Flying Dutchman, the wanderings, this is Wagner, the wanderings of Ulysses and his longing after home, house, hearth, and wife, and the wandering Jew, forever doomed to a long since outlived life. We know that Joyce read this essay in translation and this passage because in his copy of the text, he had marked the passage that came after. Ross goes on to connect Joyce's use of epiphany with Wagner's use of leitmotif. In Stephen Hero, Joyce defined an epiphany as a sudden spiritual manifestation, whether in the vulgarity of speech or of gesture, or in the memorable phrase of the mind itself. Alex Ross writes that the leitmotif serves not only as a descriptive tag, but also triggers swells of emotion, particularly when it stands for a sudden memory or premonition. In Trieste, James Joyce's library, Ross writes, was well stocked with Wagneriana. In addition to the first volume of his prose works, he owned the librettos for The Flying Dutchman, Rheingold, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung, compilations of Wagner's letters, Shaw's The Perfect Wagnerite, Nietzsche's The Case of Wagner, and a copy of Wagner's essay from 1850, Jewishness in Music. In this Thursday episode of Ulysses, a drunken Stephen Dedalus cries out the famous Siegfried cry, no tongue, followed by stage directions that, as Ross points out, are remarkably close to the stage directions at the end of Götterdämmerung. Song connects Molly Bloom in Ulysses with Blazes Boylan. A possible concert gives him an excuse to visit her. Song also connects Stephen Dedalus to the company he keeps and becomes an essential tool for Joyce, as he sought to put his father into the novel without concentrating on his father's drunkenness and improvidence, without using Ulysses to work out the set of filial resentments harbored by Joyce's brother, Stanislaus Joyce. John Stanislaus Joyce, Joyce's father, was perhaps unlucky in that he lost his job as a rate collector early in his life, and unlucky too that he did not know how to manage his finances, and unfortunate that he had so many children to feed. But his worst piece of luck actually may have been the brooding presence in his household throughout his fall from grace of his second living son, Stanislaus, who charted what happened to the family with bitterness and in some detail in two books, both published after his death. My Brother's Keeper in 1958 and The Complete Dublin Diary of Stanislaus Joyce, published in 1971. There's a remarkable difference between how John Stanislaus Joyce is treated in the work of Stanislaus, his son, and the novel Ulysses, where he appears as Simon Dedalus. Stanislaus's memoir has a raw sense of grievance, at times against both his brother and his father. There's something radiant and oddly magnificent, however, in James Joyce's deciding that he had other onions to fry besides the onions of grievance. After his father's death, James Joyce wrote to his benefactor, Harriet Shaw Weaver. I was very fond of him always, his father, being a sinner myself and even liked his faults. Hundreds of pages and scores of characters in my books came from him. I got from him his portraits, a waistcoat, a good tenor voice, an extravagant licentious disposition, out of which the greater part of any talent I may have springs, but apart from these, something else I cannot define. He told his friend Louis Gillet in Paris, the humor of Ulysses is his humor. Its people are his friends, the book is his spitting image. Since we have so much evidence about John Stanislaus Joyce as a father, it is fascinating to watch as his son set about making art from the threadbare and often miserable business of what he knew. Simon Dedalus appears or is mentioned in 7 of the 18 episodes of Ulysses. In Stanislaus's account of him, he is ostracized by his family. But when we meet him first in the Hades episode of Ulysses, he is fully socialized. In a carriage with other men on his way to Paddy Dignam's funeral, he is presented in complex ways. Bloom calls him a noisy, self-willed man, and then says, full of his son, he is right. Simon is included in the conversation as one of the company. Twice when he speaks, he is given a good sharp line of dialogue, thus establishing him as a man who is witty or has a way with words. The next time we see Simon Dedalus, he is in the offices of the Freeman's Journal. And once more, he is in company where he feels comfortable enough to exclaim, agonizing Christ, wouldn't it give you heartburn on your arse, when he's read a piece of overblown writing on the subject of Ireland. Soon he's quoting Barry. And not long after that, he is giving vent to a hopeless groan and crying shite and onions before putting on his hat and announcing, I must get a drink after that. Soon, however, the real world, or the world of Simon Dedalus' unfortunate family, makes itself felt in Wandering Rocks as two of his daughters talk in the kitchen of his house, one of them remarking, crikey, is there nothing for us to eat? Soon the other sister asks where their sibling Dilly is. Gone to meet father, she's told. The other sister replies, our Father, who art not in heaven. And then, close to the auctioneer's house, the afflicted Dilly meets her afflicted father and asks him for money. Eventually, he gives her money and says that he will be home soon. He's been placed in the position of a man whose children do not have enough money for food, as he himself moves easily in the city. A man more at home with his companions and acquaintances than with his family. Up to this, Simon has been merely part of the day, another figure who wanders in the book. But in the next episode, Sirens, which takes place at 4 o'clock in the bar and restaurant of the Ormond Hotel on Ormond Quay, Simon moves towards the centre. When his friend Lenihan puts his head around the door, he says, greetings from the famous son of a famous father. And when asked who this is, he replies, Stephen, the youthful bard. Simon's response to news about his son, who is clearly avoiding him, is subdued, almost thoughtful. Joyce wishes to create in Simon a figure of moods, an unsettled rather than a solid presence in the book, a man who often controls himself rather than a figure of easy rages. As well as possessing a talent for not having money, Simon has, as Joyce's father did, a rich tenor voice. It is courtesy of song that he redeems himself in the book as he sings Ma Paris from Flotov's Martha. This is how it is described. Through the hush of air, a voice sang to them, low, not rain, not leaves in murmur, like no voice of strings or reeds or what do you call them, dulcimers touching their still ears with words, still hearts of their each his remembered lives. Good, good to hear. Sorrow from them each seemed to from both depart when first they heard. As Bloom listens, the voice rose, sighing, change, loud, full, shining, proud. This is Simon Dedalus at his most exalted. His voice soared. A bird, it held its flight, a swift, pure cry. Soar silver orbit, leap serene, speeding, sustained, to come. Don't spin it out to long, long breath. Breath, long life, soaring high, high resplendent, to flame, crowned, high in the effulgence, symbolistic, high of the ethereal bosom, high of the vast, high iridation everywhere, all soaring all around about the wall, the endlessness. Bloom notes the glorious tone he has still. Cork air softer, also their brogue. Joyce, in this portrait of his father as an artist, has made him Simon hero among his friends. But Joyce will never let anything happen for long. As Bloom watches Simon, he muses, silly man, could have made oceans of money. And then in one pithy phrase, he returns the soaring singer to earth, wore out his wife, now sings. Simon Dedalus, after his moment of apotheosis in the book, also remembers for his friend Ben Dollard, Italians singing in Cork. He heard them as a boy in Ringabella, Crosshaven, Ringabella, singing their barcarolles, Queenstown Harbour, full of Italian ships, walking, Ben, in the moonlight with those earthquake hats, blending their voices. God, such music, Ben. Heard as a boy, Cross Ringabella, Haven, Moon Carol. In the Emmaus episode of Ulysses, Simon Dedalus's voice comes into Leopold Bloom's mind as he and Stephen walk towards Eccles Street, where Bloom lives. Bloom remembers Simon singing the aria from Martha earlier in the day, or the day before, as it now is. It was, he lets Stephen know, sung to perfection, a study of the number, in fact, which made all the others take a back seat. In the final episode of the book, known as Molly Bloom's Soliloquy, when Molly mentions living in Ontario Terrace, where John Stanislaus Joyce and his wife first lived after they were married, it is as though she and her husband have all along throughout the book been pursuing Stephen, whose mother has died, whose father has been cast aside, to become shadow versions of what his parents might have been. Bloom, having taken on some of John Stanislaus' preference, such as he's relishing the inner organs of beasts and fowls, and some of his characteristics, such as his interest in reading magazines like Titbits, or Titbits, as Stephen in turn becomes a shadow version of Bloom's son Rudy, who died as a baby, just as Stephen's older brother, John Augustine, the first boy in the family, born in Ontario Terrace, had died as a baby. Sorry, I mean that's not Stephen, but James Joyce himself. In the soliloquy, Simon Dedalus is remembered by Molly, singing a duet with her. Simon Dedalus, too, he was always turning up half screwed, singing the second verse first. The old love is the new one was one who so sweetly sang the maiden on the hawthorn bough. He was always on for flirtifying too when I sang Maritana with him. At Freddie Mayer's private opera, he had the delicious, glorious voice, Phoebe, dearest, goodbye, sweetheart, sweetheart. He always sang it, not like Bartell D'Arcy, sweet tart, goodbye. Of course, he had the gift of the voice, so there was no art in it. All over you like a warm shower bath. Oh, Maritana, wildwood flower, we sang splendidly. That was a bit too high for my register, even transposed. And he was married at the time to May Goulding. But then he'd say something to knock the good out of it, and he's a widower now. I wonder what sort his son is. He says he's an author and he's going to be a university professor of Italian. Simon Dedalus is redeemed by a voice that allows him to soar above his own circumstances. If his character is bad, then his voice is his personality, and it is capable of exquisite moments. This sense of the voice as soul, or of some element in the self which erases dull circumstances, takes on a special importance when it emerges on that walk to Eccles Street that Stephen has inherited his father's singing voice. A phenomenally beautiful tenor voice like that. This is Bloom thinking. The rarest of boons, which Bloom appreciated at the very first note he got out, could easily, if properly handled, command its own price, where baritones were 10 a penny, and procure for its fortunate possessor in the near future an entree into fashionable houses in the best residential quarters. Once more, it is song that has narrowed the distance between Simon and Stephen. It is song that connects them, just as in Bloom's mind as they approach his house. It is song that will make Molly become interested in Stephen. His wife, Bloom says, would have the greatest of pleasure in making your acquaintance, as she is passionately attached to music of any kind. This attachment to music is not only a theme in Ulysses, where many of the characters, as I said, inhabit a musical world, but the novel itself, its form, its patterns, its very tone, is animated by and nourished by the idea of sound. What words sound like, what a city sounds like, what a strange, sudden new rhythm can do to the experience of reading, making clear that prose, as much as poetry, depends on sound, even if it is read silently. Since Joyce knew what it meant to be a singer, he created Molly Bloom the singer and Simon Dedalus the singer. Nora Barnacle remarked about her husband, James Joyce, I've always told him that he should give up writing and take up singing. What he did instead was take the sense of control and release he knew from song and apply it to the written page, to prose patterns and speech patterns. From the beginning, in the poems he wrote also, as soon as he began to write, really, in the early poems, it was always there for him. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Colm. That was quite enlightening. I especially love all that early context. I mean, I frequently find that Ulysses is seen as, because it's such a masterpiece, it's seen as kind of on its own, and I like how you tie it into that whole early 20th century, other novels that also feature music in such a strong way. And you touched on the end there, Joyce's I think on his early verse. Did you mention his early verse at the end?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Yeah,
because in fact, those early poems are songs.
Yeah, and I mean, it's called chamber music. That was his first publication. It was 36 songs, I think it is. So yeah. Did have you ever if anybody has any questions, please drop them in the chat. That's fine if you don't. It's it was this quite a wonderful some great ideas here to take in and muse over for us as we lead up to Bloomsday. There's a question here from Kevin. He says, did Joyce have any formal training in music in school? You want to take that one?
I think the training he had was from home, that his mother had quite a lot of training. And of course, there's so much we don't know about those early years. And if we did know them, it might make her a much more important figure in his formation. Because she had musical training, she could read music, she was in a choir. And part of the life of the family, even though it was disrupted often by the father, was that each of them would have a party piece and that each of them would sing. And that idea of being sort of in a family like that, it becomes a really important, that sort of performance. I mentioned my friend Anthony Cronin, the poet, who talked about, the way the characters are bound by song in the novel, but he interviewed Joyce's sister, one of the sisters who survived, and he asked her, what was the difference between your brother's voice and John McCormack's voice? John McCormack was a great tenor, of course. And she answered, oh no, John McCormack was a much better singer than my brother. But when my brother sang, it broke your heart. So in other words, that if we can imagine Joyce putting all the feeling and, going on the high note and holding it and doing this as his first effort as an artist, when he's probably 6 or 7 in the family group with uncles and aunts present. And so that is the sort of training. I mean, it isn't a technical training, but it's a training in, if you forget the words, you're despised. If you don't sing the song with all your, feeling, then you're despised. So it's actually, that performative thing is actually quite important, and would have given him a great deal to work with.
And also that had he been successful in pursuing, this singing career, we have no idea really whether he would have decided then to also write, or if he would have been satisfied with expressing music just in song.
I think that in Ireland, a great number of the writers have been marvelous singers. And you often find, you've been reading someone's novels and then you're at a party and someone is singing. You think, who is that? What voice? And of course, it's the writer who's that sort of failed singer. The sort of sense that the power in the singing was bottled up into self, and it emerged then in paragraphs and words.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple comments here. Thank yous mostly. Somebody meant Steve mentions that he had Stu mentions that he had studied Joyce with Professor Zach Bowen at Harper College in '74, and he was an impassioned tenor himself, as he demonstrated well in class. So I didn't know that about Zach Bowen. I see that someone's asked me if I enjoy singing myself, and I have to explain that of all the hierarchies in Ireland, and of course we have many hierarchies because of all the bishops and priests, and although they're fading now, but one of the big hierarchies is the singers. And if you're not a good singer, your job in company is to go very quiet. And it would be considered an extraordinary thing for someone who wasn't a good singer to decide to sing. That you must always just, if someone asks you to sing, say, no, it's not the time for me to sing, and just don't do it. Because people will just never forgive you. Say, you sang before, and then name some great singer. And I was also at an event years ago where there were a lot of people who really spent a lot of their lives singing. And one of them had a famous song that she sang, and she was always known to sing it. She hadn't sung yet that evening, and a man sang her song before she did. Now, I don't know if you can imagine what that felt like. I didn't know it. I didn't realize when a friend came over and said to me, did you see what just happened? And honestly, if he'd said he'd murdered her, I'm exaggerating, but I mean, it really was an offense to decency what had occurred, that he had sung her song. So there's all sorts of rules about this. Joyce would have known all of them. How does this also happen to you when you write? I mean, are you very conscious of music in your own novels, or something, that kind of oral soundscape around you?
Yes, I suppose. See, if you're very conscious of anything when you're working, other than just getting the next sentence down, you lose something. But I do listen to a lot of music, and therefore it has to be somewhere there. But I'm not alone in that. I mean, a lot of people who don't write do that. So it's but I certainly I don't have a good singing voice, and I wish I did.
Kevin asks about the Wagner essay on Jewish culture that you mentioned, and he asked, was it anti-Semitic, and did that inspire Joyce? I think he writes here, but did that influence Joyce in any way?
Yes, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? How all those ideas were floating around, including ideas of Wagner's anti-Semitism. I think the important. I've worked as a English teacher in Barcelona in the 70s, and I'd learned something because I did classes in an academy as Joyce did, but then they want you to do private classes. They want you to come to their homes, and it means you get to see the inside of an extraordinary number of houses. You meet a range of people. You're not exactly a servant, but you're not a friend. And somehow that in-between state means you can notice much more. And of course, because Joyce was in Trieste, he was a teacher in various Jewish households, and he got to know them. And so there are various ways. And of course, Arthur Griffith, who was the founder of Sinn Féin, was really a great anti-Semite. So anti-Semitism was there in Irish nationalism. And obviously it was something that Joyce thought he could work with by putting a Jewish man at the very center of his book, which means he doesn't have to deal with all the questions of, his for example, being brought up in religion. He doesn't have to give us all what priests did to him when he was small. He doesn't have to deal with all that dull Irish stuff. He can make him a sort of cosmopolitan figure, or at least a free thinker. And but I think he got a lot of that from Trieste, just from being in the city.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kevin, for that. Another one here just jumped in. What have you taken from Joyce in your own writings? He seems like a risky author.
What's happening to me is that I'm becoming more and more fascinated by Ulysses, and it's lovely because I couldn't dream of comparing myself or even answering that question, as much as to say that the more you know about the book, the more the book becomes interesting. It gives you more and more each time. And also, there's a myth I want to really explode, is that there's often people saying that the critical writing on the book is all terrible. That's not true. Some of the best people, some of the best critical minds who are working now and in the last generation apply themselves to Ulysses, and reading their essays it can be real pleasure, because it can give you an extraordinary insight into the actual text itself. And obviously, the great arguments go on over, for example, Joyce's relationship to socialism, to nationalism, to colonialism, or indeed to gender. These are questions that preoccupy everybody now, so that Ulysses becomes our contemporary. So you can get involved in that argument, or you can simply relish an episode for something else that's going on in the episode. Some people love the jokes. Some people love the parodies. And of course, what's there all the time is a sort of density in the texture that, the number of times that Blazes Boylan is to go at 4 o'clock to really have sex with Bloom's wife. And, any other novelist would give this a massive number of very dramatic pages of him thinking about what are they doing now? It's 4:05, what are they doing now? Instead, it's just in there as a sort of glancing references. Like someone's mind might work if they were tempted to control that and not actually think about it all the time. Say, just think about something else, but it comes back into his mind. It comes back into his mind. And then there's a small question, which is a question of style, which is that this is the question that really preoccupied him as the book went on. And I think, as you know, as visitors to your library know, it really is worth studying the manuscripts of this book. And in the Morgan Library, you can see there where he has an insert in the Cyclops episode, which is one of the best things in the book. It's the list of people who attended Robert Emmet's execution. And that's an insert done really quite toward the end of composition of the book. So the more you know about how it was put together, like what was written in Trieste, what was written in Zurich, what was written in Paris, and also what books as he was reading, he was studying, He was adding to his store. Oh, and I think the other thing you need to do really is read the Odyssey. just read the Odyssey. Just get it over with. Just read the Odyssey.
Kevin also asks, do you think the man in the Macintosh represents Joyce inserting himself like Nabokov claims?
I think I actually don't think that. I think that it's true. Sometimes as he was working, he put something in that had no definite meaning. So just something that occurred to him as he worked. In other words, the book is structured and controlled. It is a planned book. You can, every episode was worked out. You can see all sorts of schemes. But as he worked in detail. And as he worked with his own glittering mind. And if anything occurred to him, I mean, it's a lovely idea that, you know, at the funeral, there's another fellow, and he gets called Mr. Macintosh, because that is the way information moves. By the end of the book, you can see the press notice. Oh, Mr. Macintosh, that's the man in the Macintosh. And that's how his name has been, that's how information moves. And but it's a lovely idea. Even if it's it's possible that it's sort of that Joyce himself, the artist at the edge of the crowd, who's going to be misnamed. And I have to say, I was teaching the novel at Columbia this semester just now, and two of the students wanted to write essays on the man in the Macintosh. So I think this man in the Macintosh is going to become a star. I think in the future, there's going to be those little people in novels that people are going to really look at to see, exactly what. But the essays were terrible. Both essays were terribly good.
Good. I wonder if that's a post Hitchcockian idea too. That Alfred Hitchcock cameo in all his works. And people understand what that is, and then go back and read other people doing the same thing in their works. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk about this tonight. Why don't we do one last question from Stu here? How do you think Love's Sweet Song and its connection to the idea of transcendence?
Oh, you have me. You have me. But very soon I will have a very long answer to that question.
All right.
But just to say that finally, with the question of song, it's never simple. Because in that same episode in Sirens, Ben Dollard sings The Croppy Boy, which is an Irish ballad, and it's set in 1798. So it's filled with the emotion of this kid who goes to confession, and the priest turns out to be a British soldier all the time, and he arrests him. And it's about how nefarious the British are. They will dress up as priests. And it's about how brave this young man was. But Ben Dollard sings it beautifully, and everyone's very moved by it, except Bloom. Bloom doesn't buy it. And he uses a phrase that I think has gone out of usage. I wonder if you know, maybe he says he thinks that Croppy Boy could have been a bit of a natural. And natural here meaning simpleton. And, to say in the Ireland of 1904, or the Ireland of 1922, or even the Ireland of now, that this martyred figure, this figure who's revered, who's, all these emotions, could have been a bit of a simpleton, could have been a bit of a natural, is really just Joyce. There's a sort of mischief sometimes that animates the book, or sort of not joining the crowd. And so Bloom is not moved by Ben Dollard's song, whereas he is moved by Simon Dedalus singing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we will finish our Bloomsday celebration on June 16th with Love's Old Sweet Song, as we do every year. That's the final song we play, and everyone sings along. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. Remind you again, we bring this program to you for free. So if you'd like to help support the Rosenbach, either by donation or by becoming a member, you could do so by visiting our website, rosenbach.org. Your support helps us care for our collections and helps us bring more programs like this one to you. And I hope to see you at our Bloomsday celebration on June 16th in person at the Rosenbach in Philadelphia, if you're around. If not, hey, we're streaming it online. And if you're not around, if you're not close to us and there's not a Bloomsday celebration close to you, I always tell everybody, well, then you should start one. Start reading Ulysses out loud somewhere and get some friends to join you. And you can celebrate Bloomsday anywhere by doing that. Colm, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right, everyone. Good night and have a happy Bloomsday. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.